Nursing school standards have dropped considerably, haven't they? That is what Dr. Thornton said 48 minutes before a Navy SEAL arrived at Mercy General asking for the nurse who saved his life in Ramadi. The fluorescent lights of the San Diego hospital cast everything in clinical white as Katie Morrison moved through the ICU with practiced invisibility, her hand steady on 4 lines and chart notations. She walked with a barely perceptible limp that old injuries left behind, and in her locker sat a pair of worn combat boots wrapped in plastic, her late husband's, still bearing Ramadi dust after all these years. She touched them every shift change, a ritual no one witnessed. The morning air in the hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, the same blend she'd known for 3 years, and Katie's breathing remained even as she navigated toward patient room 412, the cardiac wing assignment she'd been waiting for since the day she arrived. The patient in 412 was recovering from complications of an insurgent attack in Fallujah, though the hospital record said only traumatic thoracic injury, classified origin. Katie knew better. She'd served 3 tours with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, and the man in that bed had been hit by shrapnel meant for her. She was here to monitor him. Make sure no one asked questions. Ensure his recovery progressed without interference. Her position as a bedside nurse was the only cover that kept her in the cardiac wing. Her previous identity, Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, Field Operations Command, 23 years of service, had to remain buried under polyester scrubs and a name badge. She didn't flinch when Dr. Thornton appeared at the nurse's station that first evening, his presence filling the room like a tank idling in a garage, all barely contained power with nowhere to go. He was tall, expensive-looking, the kind of doctor who'd grown accustomed to being the smartest person in every room and had constructed his entire identity around maintaining that position. His watch cost more than Katie's monthly rent. His suit probably cost more than her car. When he introduced himself with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, Katie maintained her posture, shoulders slightly rounded, gaze respectful but not locked, the body language of someone trying to be smaller than they actually were. "Katie, isn't it?" His voice carried the weight of a man unused to contradiction. "Yes, Doctor." Her response came in a soft register, deferential, the voice she'd crafted 3 years ago and worn like a second skin. "I'll be overseeing the ICU rotation. I expect my protocols to be followed precisely. No shortcuts. No improvisation." He let the words hang there like a threat wearing a smile. Some nurses have a tendency to step beyond their scope of practice. "I trust that won't be an issue here." "No, Doctor." He turned away then, satisfied. He had no idea that her scope of practice included emergency surgical interventions, tactical medicine, trauma stabilization under live fire, or keeping soldiers alive in the back of a Black Hawk at 30,000 feet. He had no idea that her hands had held lives together in places where help was 3 hours away by helicopter and you either saved them or watched them die on the dust with your own 2 hands. But that information would stay buried. Katie's job was to be invisible. Unremarkable. Just another nurse in scrubs who knew her place. The first week, she proved herself in the way invisible people do. She caught a critical blood pressure drop in 412 that the resident missed. She noticed the subtle signs of infection 3 hours before cultures showed positive. She moved through the hospital like someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, her clinical assessment sharp enough to feel dangerous if anyone was paying close enough attention, but her demeanor so unobtrusive that Dr. Thornton barely registered her presence at all. Then he noticed her. And when Dr. Thornton noticed something, he brought it into the light like a hunter displaying a trophy. Grand rounds happened on Thursday morning in the hospital's largest conference room, the kind of clinical theater where reputations were built or dismantled depending on whose side of the argument you occupied. 23 residents and attending physicians sat in a semicircle as patients' cases were presented by their primary teams. Katie stood at the back, her role to observe, to take notes, to exist in the periphery of the teaching moment. Dr. Thornton had her dosage calculations projected on a screen before she understood what was happening. "Let's talk about pharmaceutical safety," he announced, and Katie's jaw tightened fractionally as she recognized her own handwriting magnified to the size of a billboard. One of our nurses prepared these dosing protocols for post-operative management. I'd like to walk through what I think qualifies as dangerous incompetence. He circled her numbers with a red marker. His voice was professorial, almost gentle, which made the words cut deeper. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The weight of his position did the work. 14 milligrams per kilogram, he read aloud, turning to face the room. Anyone here see the problem? Anyone? His eye scanned the assembled residents, all of whom suddenly found their papers very interesting. This calculation is off by a factor of 4. If a nurse administered according to these numbers, the patient would be exposed to a 56 milligram dose of a class 3 cardiac suppressant. That's not nursing. That's malpractice. Katie's hands remained perfectly steady. Her face remained a practice mask that revealed nothing. But the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the physical manifestation of someone holding themselves down so hard it took actual muscle control not to respond. The calculation wasn't wrong. She'd rounded a 14.2 milligram measurement to 14, a standard practice in hospital protocol. She'd verified it against the physician's desk reference. She'd run it through 2 cross-check systems. But Dr. Thornton wasn't here to teach. He was here to establish dominance, and Katie's competence was a threat to the image he needed to maintain, the infallible expert who didn't need to verify anything because his expertise was beyond question. One of the residents finally spoke. "Doctor, isn't that within standard rounding protocols?" Dr. Thornton's smile tightened. Standard protocols exist for those without the capability to exceed them. He turned back to the room. "I'm sure our nurse meant well, but this is exactly what happens when we hire based on credentials rather than demonstrated competence." The subtle implication hung in the air like a stain, that Katie had gotten her position through luck or connections rather than capability, that she was the product of lowered standards, that she belonged in a different category of professional altogether. The presentation moved on. The moment passed. No one in the room would have dared to advocate for a nurse against a senior attending physician. That wasn't how hospital hierarchies worked. That wasn't how power functioned. Katie didn't cry. Didn't retreat. Didn't let anything crack in her composure. She simply returned to patient 412 and completed her rounds with the same precision she'd demonstrated every day for 3 years, knowing that the real performance had just begun. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, Katie was standing at the vending machine in the break room when Dr. Thornton appeared beside her like a predator that had caught the scent of blood in the water. He didn't order coffee. He simply stood there, close enough that his presence became unavoidable, and spoke loudly enough that the 2 orderlies rearranging supplies at the far end of the hallway would hear every word. "You know, I've been reviewing hiring practices at other hospitals," he said, his voice pitched as if he were making casual conversation with the vending machine. "It's fascinating how many of them have lowered their admission standards for nursing programs in recent years. Budget cuts, I suppose. Enrollment quotas. Diversity initiatives." He paused, letting the insinuation settle like ash. "I wonder if that's how the standards got dropped so dramatically here at Mercy General. One assumes the credential inflation has to come from somewhere." Katie's fingers remained perfectly steady as she retrieved her coffee. The plastic cup felt cold against her palm. The vending machine beeped its mechanical confirmation. She didn't turn to look at him. Didn't acknowledge that she'd heard him speak. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing any reaction at all. The orderlies had stopped moving. They were pretending not to hear, but they were listening. Everyone listened when a senior physician decided to demonstrate his power in public. That was the point. "I suppose when people know they're not quite qualified, they develop workarounds," he continued, still addressing no one in particular. "Shortcuts. Compensatory strategies. It's the mind's way of managing inadequacy." His voice carried the false concern of someone discussing a patient diagnosis. "Certainly explains some of the decisions I've observed." Katie turned then. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough for him to see that she'd heard him, that she understood what he was doing, that she was choosing not to respond. That clarity in her gaze seemed to catch him off guard for just a moment, like he'd expected submission and found something else entirely, something with edges. She walked past him without speaking. The coffee cup remained steady in her hand. Her posture didn't change. Her breathing didn't accelerate. And as she moved back toward the ICU, she was already mentally accounting for the medication supplies, the equipment status, the patient assessment she needed to complete before shift change. Dr. Thornton was a distraction. The mission was what mattered. What he didn't know was that every minute she spent absorbing his contempt was worth the intelligence access she maintained, the proximity to patient 412 she preserved, the cover that kept her invisible. 3 years. That's how long she'd been waiting for this assignment. 3 years of scrubs instead of tactical gear. 3 years of bedside manner instead of operation orders. 3 years of being small because the person in cardiac bed 412 was worth 3 years of anything. The next morning, she was starting an 4 on a Marine Corps veteran in room 309, a man recovering from orthopedic surgery, when his hands gripped the bed railing and his eyes went pale beneath his weathered skin. Katie's hands were moving through the procedure with the fluid precision that came from 100 field operations, from combat zones where speed meant the difference between a soldier living and a soldier dying, from training that had been beaten into her muscle memory until it required no conscious thought at all. "I've only seen one medic use that combat insertion technique," the Marine whispered, his voice carrying the weight of recognition that changed everything. "You served in Ramadi, didn't you?" Katie's hands didn't pause. The 4 slid home. She secured the line with a professional efficiency that looked routine to any observer. But something inside her had shifted, like a door opening that she'd kept locked for 3 years. "Yes," she said quietly, and that single word carried the weight of an identity she'd buried, a life she'd set aside, a version of herself she'd learned to hide. The Marine's eyes filled with tears. "I've never forgotten your face." Dr. Thornton sat at his desk reviewing patient request forms, his manicured fingers moving through the stack with increasing tension. Every single one from the past week mentioned the same name. Katie Morrison. Again. And again. And again. 23 requests in 7 days, all specifically for her, all from patients recovering in his post-surgical wards. His reputation, 20 years of careful institutional cultivation, board dinners, golf outings with senior physicians, the kind of reputation that moved through hospitals like currency, was being systematically dismantled by a nurse who'd been at Mercy General less than 6 months. He set the forms down and picked up his phone. First call went to Gerald Hastings, his college roommate and board member. Thornton kept his voice measured, professional, concerned. "We may have a liability issue with nursing staff practicing beyond their scope," he said. "Some troubling documentation I've been reviewing. Thought you should know before it becomes a problem." Hastings murmured the right sympathetic sounds. By the time Thornton hung up, the seed was planted. A board member now worried about liability meant a board member who would ask questions. The mechanics of institutional power worked like a Swiss watch if you wound it correctly. Second call went to the nursing administrator at her previous hospital in Phoenix, framed as a reference check. "Just verifying some credentials for our records," Thornton said smoothly. "Can you speak to her clinical judgment? Any concerns during her time there?" The administrator hesitated, that tiny pause that meant volumes. Yes, there were concerns. Yes, she'd left suddenly. No, she wouldn't elaborate, but the tone of her silence did the work for her. Another thread pulled. By Wednesday, he'd activated an outside investigator who specialized in healthcare fraud and credential verification. "I need a full employment audit," he told the investigator directly. "Every chart she's touched in the past 6 months. Every medication she's administered. Every procedure she assisted with. I need discrepancies." The investigator quoted a fee. Thornton authorized it without hesitation. Money was never the obstacle. Money was the solution. Katie continued her shifts at Mercy General with the same steady precision that had kept her alive through 3 years in Ramadi. Thursday morning, she noticed the security camera outside the cardiac wing had been repositioned, now angled directly at the recovery room where her asset lay, a former Dari translator named Hassan who'd saved 17 American lives during combat operations and was currently recovering from a triple bypass surgery under the most precarious of circumstances. The federal protection detail that would relocate him safely wasn't scheduled for 3 more weeks. 3 weeks meant she had to stay close, had to maintain access, had to keep her cover intact and her presence plausible. The positioning of that camera meant Thornton was starting to isolate her, starting to restrict her movements, starting to use institutional tools against her instead of just words. In the break room on Friday afternoon, Katie overheard 2 ICU nurses discussing charts and Dr. Thornton's name. "He's reviewing everything she's touched for the past 6 months, one of them whispered, glancing around before continuing. "Says he's looking for discrepancies. Documentation issues. My friend in record said he asked for her entire file from day one." The other nurse shook her head. "She seems so careful though." "I don't see how." "Doesn't matter," the first one interrupted. "If he's looking hard enough, he'll find something. Doctors always do when they want to." Katie stood at the coffee station, her hand steady as she poured lukewarm liquid into a styrofoam cup, her face revealing nothing. But she understood what was happening. The public humiliation phase was complete. This was escalation. This was the coordinated institutional assassination of her professional credibility, methodical and relentless as an approaching tide. That evening, Katie sat in her apartment in a neighborhood near the naval base where the rent was cheap and the neighbors didn't ask questions. She opened the plastic bag she'd kept in the back of her bedroom closet for 3 years, pulling out the pair of worn combat boots that had belonged to her husband, Marcus. The leather was creased from 1,000 patrols through Ramadi's hostile districts. The soles were embedded with dust that no amount of cleaning would ever remove. There was still dried blood visible on the left heel, rust brown and permanent as a tattoo. Marcus had died 14 hours before she could reach him, bleeding out in a field hospital where the surgeon had made a calculation error with his blood loss percentage. A mistake. A moment of miscalculation. A man dead because someone wasn't paying attention. She ran her fingers over that dried blood and allowed her hands to tremble for exactly 10 seconds, the only 10 seconds of the day when Katie Morrison was permitted to break her composure. Then she locked the boots away again and returned to her apartment's small kitchen, where she methodically prepared the meals she would eat throughout the week, each one measured and controlled and exactly what it needed to be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came Monday morning when Katie arrived for her shift and found the ICU assignment board had been completely restructured. Her name had been removed from the cardiac wing rotation entirely. Instead, she'd been assigned to the orthopedic ward, the furthest possible distance from Hassan's recovery room while still remaining in the hospital. She checked the assignment 3 times, certain there was a mistake. There wasn't. Dr. Thornton's strategy had shifted from public humiliation to institutional isolation, and he'd done it with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Katie made her way to the orthopedic ward, her scrubs crisp despite the humidity of the San Diego morning, her badge clipped to her collar at exactly the right angle. A patient in room for 12 needed a dressing change on a compound fracture. She completed the task with the same meticulous care she applied to everything, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 medical procedures, but her mind was calculating. 3 weeks until Hassan's detail arrived. 3 weeks of being systematically locked out of the one area where her presence mattered. 3 weeks of watching her carefully constructed cover collapse while a Navy SEAL translator lay vulnerable in a recovery room without protection. At lunch, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "Been repositioning staff all morning. Thornton's been on calls non-stop. Whatever you did, he's committed to ending it." The message came from Marcus Chen, one of the orderlies who'd been present when Thornton had made his comments about nursing school standards. He'd been kind to her since that moment, had never made her feel the weight of the humiliation. Now he was warning her. The news travels fast in a hospital. Everyone could sense blood in the water. Dr. Thornton was in his office making his 4th phone call of the day, this time to the hospital administrator directly. "I need to escalate some concerns," he said, his tone suggesting reluctance, as if he'd prefer not to be making this call but professional responsibility demanded it. "I discovered some serious documentation irregularities with one of our nursing staff. Medication administration records that don't match pharmacy dispensing reports. Procedure notes that appear to have been altered. Patient charts with timeline discrepancies." The administrator listened with increasing concern. "Which nurse?" Thornton paused, letting the weight of silence build drama. "Katie Morrison. I've engaged an outside investigator. You may want to notify our legal department." By the time he hung up, the trap was completely constructed. Board member aware. Previous employer contacted. Outside investigator hired. Hospital administration notified. A Navy SEAL in recovery without her protection. A 3-year mission 3 weeks from completion. And Katie Morrison, Master Chief Petty Officer, 3 times decorated for valor, 247 combat saves under fire, sitting in the orthopedic ward changing the dressing on a broken femur, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached, her hand so steady that the patient commented on her extraordinary gentleness. "You must really love this job," the patient said as she finished securing the gauze. Katie met his eyes for one moment, and something in her expression made him go very still. "I do," she said quietly. "I save lives. That's what I do." Then she wheeled the medication cart out of the room and continued down the hallway, every step controlled, every breath measured, every second of restraint costing her more than anyone watching could possibly understand. She continued down the hallway, every step controlled, every breath measured, every second of restraint costing her more than anyone watching could possibly understand. The medication cart wheel squeaked against the linoleum, a sound like old bones complaining, and Katie kept her hand steady on the push bar despite the tightness spreading across her chest. She had learned long ago that panic was just information delivered at the wrong speed, and right now she needed clarity more than air. Tuesday morning arrived grey and heavy. The administrator's office smelled like expensive coffee and the particular staleness that came from sealed windows on the 14th floor, the kind of air that had been recycled through the same machinery for 3 years, which was exactly how long Katie had been at Mercy General, exactly how long she'd been protecting her asset, exactly how long she'd been holding her breath. The administrator, a woman named Janet Pierce with silver-streaked hair and the expression of someone delivering bad news that wasn't quite her fault, gestured to the chair across from her desk. Not the comfortable one near the window. The one that made you sit forward, defensive, like you'd already lost. "Dr. Thornton has raised concerns," Janet began, her fingers threaded together on the desk blotter like she was holding her own hands hostage. "About your clinical judgment. Specifically about medication calculations and your independence in critical situations." Katie didn't move. Didn't blink. The art of invisibility was understanding that reaction was a form of visibility. "I see. He's documented several instances. Questioned your protocols. He's concerned about patient safety." Janet paused, waiting for Katie to fill the silence. Katie didn't. The hospital takes these concerns very seriously. Until the investigation concludes, you're restricted from all critical care assignments. Effective immediately, you're being moved to the recovery ward. 3 to 4 hour post-op monitoring. Standard vitals, comfort care, nothing beyond basic nursing protocols. The recovery ward was 3 floors down from the cardiac wing. 3 floors away from her patient. 3 floors from the translator who'd been secretly funneling intelligence for 18 months, who was scheduled for discharge in 14 days, who had no idea that his primary physician wanted him dead or compromised or simply damaged enough to discredit everyone who'd ever helped him. Katie's jaw tightened fractionally. Her hands remained perfectly steady. "How long will the investigation take?" Dr. Thornton initiated a formal review with the board. An outside investigator from the State Medical Board. "We're looking at 6 to 8 weeks. 14 days until discharge. 8 weeks of investigation." The gap was impossible. Katie had trained for impossible scenarios, desert infiltrations with 2 hours of water, extraction coordinates that shifted hourly, intelligence assets who turned out to be double agents, but she'd never trained for this particular flavor of failure. This one was slow. This one was administrative. This one was happening in fluorescent light while she sat perfectly still in an uncomfortable chair. She stood. When do I start in recovery? Today. I'm sorry, Katie. I know this is difficult. Janet's apology had the shape of sincerity but not the substance. She'd already decided, already moved on, already filed Katie into the category of problems that weren't worth solving. You can gather your personal items from your locker during lunch. Katie's personal items consisted of a change of scrubs, a bottle of ibuprofen, and the pair of worn combat boots she kept in the bottom of her locker, the one she'd been carrying since her husband died 11 years ago. Not carrying. Guarding. They were the last thing he'd touched with his own hands before an RPG made hands irrelevant. She nodded once and left the office without saying goodbye. The recovery ward was 8 patient beds in a windowless corner of the 4th floor, painted a color that management probably called soothing sage but was actually the exact shade of institutional surrender. The nurses here moved through their shifts like people clocking hours instead of saving lives. Nothing wrong with that, not everyone could hold the weight. But Katie's hands, the ones that had learned to stop bleeding in a Ramadi street market with nothing but pressure and prayer, felt like they were being asked to forget how to do their job. The recovery ward was where you went after the real doctors finished. Aftercare. The consolation prize of nursing. She worked through the afternoon rotating patients every 15 minutes, checking surgical dressings and foresights, helping a woman in her 60s sit up without tearing her abdominal incision open. The work was competent and empty. A 67-year-old hip replacement patient named Dorothy asked her to adjust the morphine drip, and Katie calculated the dose instantly, 0.04 milligrams per kilogram body weight, distributed intravenously over 2 minutes, and administered it without even writing the numbers down. Muscle memory in the form of mathematics. The body knew what the mind was trying to forget. Around 4:51 p.m., the intercom crackled to life. Cardiology staff meeting. Conference room beat immediate. Katie heard the announcement and kept working. It wasn't her department anymore. Dr. Thornton's voice came through the intercom again, louder this time, as if volume could compensate for the fact that he was losing his narrative. All cardiac ward personnel. This is mandatory. She watched the other nurses file out. Watched them understanding they were being called to witness something. That's what Thornton did. He didn't just attack, he orchestrated. He created audiences for his victories. Katie finished documenting Dorothy's pain assessment and headed upstairs instead, taking the stairwell instead of the elevator because elevators had witnesses and she needed to move without being seen. The cardiac ward was quieter without its daytime staff. Only the machines working, the ventilators and monitors conducting their precise electronic conversation, the kind of music that played when humans were no longer quite sure how to keep themselves alive. She moved through the corridor with the fluid precision of someone who knew where every camera had a blind spot, where the patient charts were stored, and exactly where her asset was. He was sleeping, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded like victory. His name was officially listed as Khalil, and his English was formal and precise, taught in Kandahar to someone who understood that language was a weapon. He'd been a Taliban translator for 7 years until his brother was killed in a US airstrike targeting the wrong coordinates. That was the moment intelligence agencies understood they had an asset. Not because of ideology. Because of grief. Because grief made people willing to risk everything. Katie pulled up his chart, his real chart, not the sanitized version Thornton had been using. Stable. Healing well. Scheduled discharge in 11 days now, not 14. Someone had accelerated his timeline. That someone was probably Thornton, trying to close the file, remove the evidence, bury the asset before the investigation into Katie could expand into questions about why she'd been so devoted to one particular patient's care. She heard footsteps approaching and moved away from the bedside, positioning herself near the supply cabinet like she was restocking something. A resident passed her without looking. She waited until the footsteps faded, then touched Khalil's forehead briefly, a gesture that meant nothing in English and everything in the language of people who'd survived things that didn't have words. Back in the recovery ward, she clocked out at 6:15 p.m. and drove to Mount Hope Cemetery under a sky the color of bruised concrete. The rain started before she pulled into the parking lot, one of those San Diego rains that fell like an accusation, cold and unexpected in a place where weather wasn't supposed to have emotion. She stood at Michael's grave for 23 minutes without an umbrella. The headstone was still sharp, still crisp, still contained his name and the dates like a sentence that hadn't been finished properly. Michael James Morrison. 1987 to 2012. Beloved husband. Master Chief Petty Officer, Naval Special Warfare Command. I failed you again, she said to the stone. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't been trained to keep sounds locked down. 3 years of careful positioning. 3 years of protecting Khalil. All of it collapsed this morning because one doctor saw something he didn't like and decided to burn the mission instead of accepting that he wasn't the smartest person in the room. The rain intensified, hammering the grass and the cemetery paths and the headstone with the kind of persistence that suggested it might never stop. Katie's scrubs were soaked through, her hair plastered to her skull, and she stood perfectly still because movement would mean she was leaving and she wasn't ready to leave yet. She wasn't ready to accept that sometimes you did everything right and lost anyway. She wasn't ready to accept that Thornton had found the leverage point and crushed it and she couldn't do anything about it because the moment she moved against him directly, she became visible in ways that compromised the entire operation. The asset gets discharged in 11 days. Without me monitoring him, Thornton will be his primary. She paused. Rain filled the pause. I don't know if Khalil survives his discharge without someone watching his back. I don't know if I survive mine. She stayed until her body temperature began to match the weather, until her hands stopped trembling from cold and started trembling from something else, something she hadn't permitted herself to feel since Michael died. She stayed until the cemetery gate started closing and the groundskeeper drove past twice asking if she needed help. Then she got back in her car, drove to her apartment, and sat in the dark with her husband's boots in her lap, the rubber still faintly stained with remedy dust that would never come out no matter how hard you tried to clean it. The suspension letter arrived Wednesday morning by certified mail. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending the conclusion of the internal investigation. You are not permitted on hospital premises. Your access card has been deactivated. Your employment status will be determined upon completion of the review process. She held the letter in both hands, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that some missions didn't have victory conditions. Some missions just ended. And sometimes the people you were trying to save had to find another way to survive. The code alarm screamed at 2:24 a.m. Katie was restocking the supply closet in recovery when the first blast cut through the hospital's quiet night rhythm, that particular shriek that meant cardiac wing, meant immediate, meant the difference between the next heartbeat and flatline. She didn't pause. Didn't check the clock or calculate whether this was her problem anymore. 3 years of instinct moved faster than the suspension letter sitting unsigned in the administrator's office upstairs. Room for 12. Marcus Webb. The monitor told the story in green phosphorescence, rhythm deteriorating, pressure dropping, heart rate climbing toward numbers that meant minutes, not hours. His chest heaved with the desperate breathing of a body shutting down, blood pressure dropping like a stone down a well. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac, crushing the heart from the outside, turning the strongest muscle in the body into a trapped animal. The on-call surgeon was 6 minutes out. Katie did the math instantly. 6 minutes was death in this room. She moved. The pericardiocentesis kit sat on the crash cart next to the defibrillator pads and the intubation supplies. Her hands found it like they'd find a rifle in the dark. 23 years of muscle memory doesn't care about suspension letters or administrative restrictions or the fact that she wasn't authorized to perform anything beyond for insertion. 23 years of field medicine in places where surgeons didn't exist and people either lived because you moved fast or they died because you hesitated. Webb's breathing was shallow now. Panicked. The monitor showed the electrical pattern of a heart being suffocated. 90 seconds. That's all the window she had before cardiac arrest became permanent. Katie's hands didn't shake. They never did under pressure. That was the difference between people who froze and people who'd held someone's chest cavity open in 127-degree heat while calling for a medevac that might never come. Her fingers found the angle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, needle angled down and back like she'd learned it yesterday instead of 16 years ago in a forward operating base that didn't exist on any American map. The 14-gauge angiocath slid through skin and cartilage with a sensation like breaking through ice. The needle advanced. Her eyes tracked the monitor. Webb's pressure was 58/32 now. His oxygen sat dropping toward the low 60s. The heart was suffocating, pumping against the weight of fluid pressing down on it from every direction. The needle kissed the pericardial sac. The hiss of air escaping. Of pressure releasing. Of fluid draining from the space where it was killing him. Dark blood flowed through the catheter into the collection bag, 30 milliliters, 50, 70. Webb's rhythm changed on the monitor. The desperation flattening out. The electrical chaos settling into something that resembled a heartbeat again. "There you go," Katie whispered, her voice level as someone commenting on the weather. "Come on back." His oxygen climbed. 62, 68. 72, his blood pressure rose like air returning to lungs. The monitor's rhythm strip showed the wild desperation collapsing into something coherent, something living, something that might walk out of this room instead of being rolled out. 100 milliliters total. She capped the needle, disposed of it into the sharps container with the kind of practiced precision that comes from doing something right 1,000 times, and stepped back. Webb's eyes fluttered. His breathing deepened. His body relaxed against the bed like someone waking from a nightmare. The sinus rhythm on the monitor, clean, regular, alive, beeped its steady reassurance. Then Dr. Thornton walked through the door. His face went white when he saw Katie standing there, the empty pericardiocentesis kit on the beside table, Webb's vitals displayed across the monitor showing a man who'd been 2 minutes from death and was now breathing normally. For exactly 3 seconds, he said nothing. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched at his sides. Then he turned to the night shift supervisor hovering in the doorway. "Did she just perform a surgical procedure without authorization?" Katie didn't look at him. She was already pulling on gloves to check Webb's lung sounds, to document what she'd done, to move toward the next thing that needed doing because the work didn't stop for institutional politics. "Get me a chest x-ray," she said to the tech. Her voice had changed already, not deferential, not apologetic. Just a command. "I need to verify lung expansion. And get cardiology down here for monitoring. This man needs continuous observation for 12 hours minimum." Dr. Thornton's face shifted from white to purple. He left without another word. Katie heard his footsteps accelerate in the hallway. She heard him make a phone call at the nurse's station, his voice low and sharp, the kind of tone someone uses when they're burning bridges with controlled fury. By 6 a.m., his network had been fully activated. By 8:11 a.m., the administrator's assistant called to say Katie was needed in the office immediately. Not requested. Needed. Which meant summoned. Which meant over. The administrator didn't look up when she walked in. Dr. Thornton stood beside his desk like they'd been waiting for her specifically, like this was the moment they'd been positioning for all along. The file was open in front of the administrator's hands, her employment record, her reference checks, the incident reports that had been filed against her. Allegations of practicing medicine beyond her scope. Of overstepping. Of dangerous competence masquerading as nursing. Master Chief Morrison, the administrator started. Katie's jaw tightened fractionally. That single word, the rank instead of her first name, meant this wasn't about what she'd done. It was about what they'd just learned. About the fact that Thornton had accessed something he shouldn't have. Her classified background had somehow made it into the hospital's investigation materials. Someone at the Pentagon had made a mistake. Or someone had made a very deliberate call to ensure that Katie Morrison's dual identity was now known to the administration of Mercy General. "I have no choice," the administrator continued, and his voice carried the careful tone of someone following a script written by lawyers. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending formal termination. Security will escort you to your locker. You'll collect your personal items and leave the premises. You're not to return to any department or patient care area. This is non-negotiable." Katie nodded once. Not in agreement. Just in acknowledgement of what everyone in the room already understood, that her 3 years of careful positioning, her mission to protect the intelligence asset in the cardiac wing, her invisible work that no one was ever supposed to know about, was over. Collapsed in a single morning. Destroyed by a surgeon's wounded pride and access to information that should have stayed classified. The security guard escorted her to her locker in the basement where the nursing staff stored their things. She opened the door and looked at the sparse contents: a spare uniform she'd never wear again, a coffee mug someone had given her last Christmas, and the plastic bag at the bottom containing her husband's worn combat boots. They'd been sitting in her car trunk for 6 months, waiting for the right moment to bury them with full honors. Now that moment would have to come while she wasn't employed anywhere at all. Security walked her to the parking lot in the early morning darkness. The city was just starting to wake up, the distant sound of traffic building on I-5, the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with the salt air from the bay. Katie placed the plastic bag on the passenger seat and sat there for 45 minutes without starting the engine, watching the sun crest over the buildings downtown. That night she stood alone at his grave in the rain, the boots finally removed from their bag and placed on the wet grass at the headstone's base. The cemetery was empty except for the hum of wind through the eucalyptus trees and the steady percussion of rain against stone. Her husband's name was carved there: James Morrison, 1978 to 2009, killed in action, Helmand Province, standing beside a young man who'd gotten hit by shrapnel meant for someone else. "I failed you again," Katie told the stone, her voice steady despite the rain. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't breaking. That wasn't how people who'd survived what she'd survived did things. "Failed the mission. Failed everyone who trusted me to complete what you started." The rain intensified. She stood there for another hour, the boots at her feet, her husband's grave marker in front of her, and the weight of 3 years of invisible work settling into the space where it would live now, not in the cardiac wing at Mercy General, but in the private catalogue of missions that went unfinished, people who didn't get saved, promises that broke in the darkness when nobody was watching. But that night, 72 miles north in a small house near Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, a Navy SEAL named Marcus Webb sat at his kitchen table with a laptop open in front of him, scrolling through the classified personnel database he still had access to through his military medical retirement account. His fingers moved across the keyboard. Name: Catherine Morrison. Service record: Master Chief Petty Officer, Navy SEAL Teams, Operation Remedy 2006, 17 lives saved under fire, 3 pieces of shrapnel still embedded in her back from a day she'd taken rounds meant for someone else. He'd spent 3 years since waking up in Mercy General trying to find her. 3 years of dead ends and classified walls and people who wouldn't talk. And now he had her name. Her actual name. The woman who'd saved his life had been working at his hospital the entire time, hidden in plain sight, wearing a name tag that said Katie and a composure that never cracked. He picked up his phone and made a call to someone who still owed him favors. A rear admiral. A man who understood that debts between warriors didn't expire, and that when a Master Chief Petty Officer saved your life, you spent whatever it took to make sure the world knew what she'd done. Dr. Thornton sat in the administrator's office with the investigation file spread across his lap, his fingers moving through page after page of Katie Morrison's employment records. Everything was there: the background check, the reference letters, the initial medical records. And then his eyes caught something that made his throat tighten. A document marked with a red classified stamp. Master Chief Petty Officer. Operation Remedy. 17 combat saves under fire. His face went grey as the word sank in, and for the first time since this morning started, Dr. Thornton understood that he wasn't fighting a nurse. He was fighting a legend. And legends didn't lose to men like him. The conference room was packed, board members in the third row, the hospital's legal counsel with a laptop already open, the press liaison standing near the door with her phone positioned like a weapon. Dr. Thornton had called this meeting to present his case, to show the documentation of Katie's unauthorized medical intervention, to prove that a nurse had crossed into practicing medicine without a license. He was ready. He'd prepared remarks. He'd contacted allies. He'd weaponized every institutional tool available to him. The room went quiet as the conference room doors opened and a man in navy dress whites limped through them, moving with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned to ignore pain decades ago. The room didn't recognize him. But Katie did the moment his eyes found hers. The Navy SEAL who'd crashed at 2 a.m. The patient whose life she'd saved when every protocol said to wait for the on-call surgeon. He walked to the front of the conference room with medals on his chest that caught the fluorescent light, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority that couldn't be questioned or challenged. "That's Reaper 6, he said quietly, and the room went absolutely still. Nobody breathed. The security guard who'd been standing near the door, the same guard who'd threatened to escort Katie from the hospital just 6 hours earlier, suddenly came to attention with a sharp movement that echoed off the walls. "Master Chief Morrison, 2nd Battalion," he said, his voice steady and clear. The entire staff knew what that meant. That rank didn't work as a nurse. That rank commanded nations. The Rear Admiral walked through the conference room doors like he'd been waiting for his cue, carrying a file folder that looked exactly like the one Dr. Thornton had dropped. His uniform seemed to occupy more space than his body should allow, and when he began reading, his voice didn't rise or fall, it just stated facts with the certainty of men who dealt in national security. "Master Chief Katie Morrison, Navy Nurse Corps. Bronze Star." He paused. The room held its breath. "Silver Star." Another pause. Katie's jaw remained perfectly steady, though her eyes had narrowed fractionally. The Admiral continued reading, each medal its own sentence, each one a hammer blow. 2 Purple Hearts. Katie's hands locked together at her sides, her shoulders absolutely still. And 1 Navy Cross. The silence in the conference room wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that came from understanding that everything everyone had just witnessed was real and monumental, and they'd been standing next to it the entire time without knowing. The patient stepped forward, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. "She took shrapnel meant for me in Ramadi. Shrapnel that should have gone through my chest." He paused, swallowing hard. "She spent 3 years finding me here because I never got to thank her for my life." The words hung in the air like they'd been carved into stone. Katie's expression didn't shift. Her composure held. But her eyes, finally, showed everything. The weight of 3 years. The impossible mission she'd been sent to complete. The loyalty to a husband who died starting this work. The cost of silence and restraint and duty that nobody had even known to honor. The Admiral turned to Dr. Thornton with the kind of movement that suggested this was the moment he'd come for. "Dr. Thornton, you are relieved of your position at this facility, effective immediately, for knowingly obstructing a federal protection operation." Thornton's face drained of color completely. His mouth opened but no words came. I had no idea," the hospital's legal counsel cut him off without looking up from her laptop. "Your employment file contained military liaison status on page 3. You accessed that file on 7 separate occasions." She turned the screen so the board could see his login records. "You were briefed on the cardiac wing security protocols when the federal asset was admitted. You signed the briefing form." Thornton's hand moved to his collar. The press liaison had her phone out, recording. The board had already decided this termination would be public, a statement about institutional values, about what happened to men who weaponized their authority against women who were actually heroes. Security approached Thornton with the kind of professional distance that came from doing this work too many times. He had to walk the entire length of the conference room to reach the door, past the nursing staff he'd commanded, past the residents he'd intimidated, past the 2 nurses he'd used as spies against Katie. None of them looked at him directly. The administrator held the conference room door open with cold professionalism that was somehow worse than anger. As security escorted him out, the Marine veteran spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear. I knew there was something wrong with him. The room erupted, conversations igniting like wildfire, voices overlapping, the tension breaking like a dam. But Katie remained absolutely motionless against the back wall, her eyes fixed on a point beyond everyone in the room. Her hands trembled for exactly 3 seconds before she locked them together. Webb crossed the conference room toward her, moving with more confidence than he'd shown all week. When he reached her, he didn't say anything. He just stood beside her, and finally, Katie allowed herself to meet his eyes. The moment stretched. Then she nodded, the smallest gesture, and something in her expression shifted. The mask loosened, just barely. The professional composure remained, but underneath it, people could see the exhaustion of 3 years falling away like a weight being set down. 6 months later, Katie stood in her Master Chief uniform at a medal ceremony in San Diego, the morning light catching the ribbons on her chest. The translator she'd protected, the one she'd spent 3 years positioning herself to watch over, had been safely relocated under federal witness protection, and he'd sent a letter that the Rear Admiral read aloud. It thanked her for completing the mission her husband had begun. It said that because of her, his family would live. The words echoed through the auditorium, and Katie stood at attention with her hands at her sides, her face a study in controlled emotion. Marcus Webb stood beside her, the cane long gone, his wounds healed enough that he could stand without favoring his left leg. Before the ceremony concluded, he presented her with a shadow box containing the shrapnel fragments that surgeons had removed from her back in Ramadi, pieces of metal and bone that had nearly killed her. He'd kept them for 3 years. He'd carried them through recovery and physical therapy and the knowledge that the medic who'd saved him was still out there somewhere. Now he was returning them to their owner. You should have these back, he said simply. Katie accepted the shadow box without speaking. That evening, Katie drove to the cemetery in San Diego with Webb, and together they approached a grave marked with a headstone bearing her husband's name and the date he'd died in Ramadi, beside a memorial stone carved with 3 additional names, soldiers from his unit whose lives were connected to the mission Katie had just completed. Katie carried her husband's combat boots, the one she'd kept in her car trunk for 3 years, the worn leather creased from constant movement. The boots that had survived Ramadi when their owner hadn't. She and Webb lowered the boots into the earth beside the memorial stone, and then Webb placed his own seal trident on top of the grave, a warrior's salute to warriors who'd come before. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. He'd be proud of you, Master Chief. Katie's hands were finally, completely steady as she raised her right hand and saluted. The gesture held for 10 full seconds, her arm rigid, her eyes fixed on the headstone. When she lowered her hand, rain had started falling, not the cold rain from 3 years ago when she'd stood here alone, but gentle rain, the kind that felt like release. She learned through military channels that Dr. Thornton was teaching CPR certification classes at a San Diego community college for $19 an hour, his medical license suspended pending a comprehensive review of his patient care decisions from his entire tenure at Mercy General. The hospital's press liaison had released the video of his firing, and it went viral online, for million views in the first month, shared by military families and nurses and people who understood what they were watching. Someone had added a title card at the end. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. Katie never watched it herself, but Webb had told her that he'd had it framed in his office, a reminder that lived on his wall. A reminder that competence and character eventually triumph over reputation and ego. That the quiet person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. That true power isn't a title or a uniform, it's the willingness to sacrifice everything for people you'll never get to thank. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and let me know, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were completely wrong about who they were?